Nancy founded ESG Partners early in 2021, following a 25-year career spent largely at the executive level. Her experience spans numerous industry sectors, focusing on growth and diversification, creating opportunities for social change while delivering economic value. She has worked with a multitude of organizations, from startups to multinational companies, investors, governments, and regulators, both domestically and internationally, and understands what drives success. A chartered professional accountant, a fellow of the profession, and a chartered director, Nancy is also educated in leading global sustainability standards and frameworks, including GRI and TCFD, and is an FSA Credential Level 2 candidate in ESG with the Sustainability Accounting Standard Board. Welcome, Nancy.
Great, thank you very much, Julia. I'm assuming everybody can hear me. If not, maybe give me a thumbs down. So we should be good to go. So welcome everyone, and it is exciting to be here on Invest Nova Scotia's first official day. So what we'll do is I'm going to share with you our agenda for today, and to give you a sense of how the morning is going to flow. And I'd also like to introduce some other individuals who I have with me here today. Phil G, Sarah Weston, also with ESG Partners, and Sarah Lamb has also been instrumental in this from Invest Nova Scotia, and also Lindy Greening and Sven Schultz. I think I pronounced his last name quite right, but from the province and from Net Zero Atlantic. So what we're going to do today is to provide some basic knowledge around ESG and to help you start to think about how to implement ESG within your businesses. This is an introductory workshop, so we will be sort of scratching the surface, if you will, but it will help you to get started and to start thinking about how these issues and factors may affect your business and provide some opportunities. So this morning we build the foundation. And then as we get into the latter part of the morning, we'll start to apply it using an example. This will be an interactive workshop, so please don't hesitate to ask questions as we go. We have some breaks planned. We really encourage you to network with each other during the breaks. And also at the times where we do have some breakout rooms and then we come back together, I may call on you. So we'll work through that as we get closer to those breakout rooms. So our focus, we're going to be developing an understanding of ESG, learning about how ESG factors can influence your business performance, and to consider a business case that will start looking at SMEs and the context of risk and opportunities. So as we get started, the first question we're going to ask you to start to think about is, what is ESG? Now we're going to put up a little poll, and we just want you to rate your understanding of ESG on a scale of 1 to 6. Do you have an idea of what it is? Are you more advanced with a good understanding? Are you already incorporating it into your business? We did ask your input during the registration process, but sometimes it's good too for others who are in this session to get a sense of who's on who's in the session and what your level of comfort is. Okay, so we're just seeing some of the results coming in now. Okay, so we do have a couple of individuals who are at a very high level of understanding, so I might get you to share in just a couple of minutes. And then some with some understanding and a good level of understanding. And that's honestly kind of what I would have expected. And the individual who has none at all, don't worry, we'll definitely make sure that you don't leave with that same feeling. So that's great. I'm glad to have you all here. Okay, so everybody has answered based on who's on right now. So, okay, so some understanding and a good understanding, so that's great. What I would love to be able to do is, would anyone like to sort of raise their hand and we can unmute you, who might want to share, those who might be sort of at that level of, none at all or some understanding, what you're hoping to get out of this session. It's sort of hard for me to kind of pull you out, but if you wouldn't mind just to raise your hand, and Sarah Lamb is going to keep an eye on that. And just if you wouldn't mind sharing with us what you're hoping to get from today's session. I'll just give a couple of minutes to see if anybody does sort of raise their hand and want to share with us. Okay, I'm not seeing anybody's hand raised, so I'll just assume everybody's quite shy. And is there anyone then on the other end of the spectrum who did rate themselves as being a 5 out of 6 or a 6 out of 6, who may want to share with us maybe a little bit about your journey and how you started and what brings you here today? And maybe I'm putting everyone on the spot so early in the morning. Okay. Well, if anyone would like to raise their hand as we go through, that would be great. So I guess just some things to think about as we're going through this. When we start talking about whether or not your company has HR policies and whether or not they consider diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility. What about workplace safety policies? And what about government agreements that may incorporate some ESG factors in terms of procurement policies or procurement requirements and supply chain? All of those areas fall under ESG. If you may recall, a few years ago, we got into a little problem where we saw Volkswagen get into a little bit of a problem when it came to statements around their emissions. And when you think about emissions and how important of an issue that is in terms of climate change and climate impact, VW did get in, perhaps overstated with what they were doing in terms of emissions reductions. That was a huge issue for the company, both from a reputational standpoint, which then, of course, turned into a financial impact. Also, we're seeing a lot going on right now with Tesla, and Tesla in terms of the racism that's been identified in some of their factories, and also safety violations and not responding as quickly to some of the safety issues that have been raised in terms of their batteries used within their vehicles. These two are turning into problems that are both reputational, financial, and also impacting their relationships with their key stakeholders. So all of these are ESG issues. And, although these are big company issues, we will start to go through and you'll start to see how they actually do come down to the, to the level of, micro-sized businesses raised to small and medium-sized enterprises. So we'll be going through those. So what is ESG? Oops, hang on a second, let me close the poll here. There we go. So, and why is it that we're hearing so much about ESG now? So the acronym ESG was actually first coined back in 2005, and it was written about in a report for the United Nations Environment Program Finance Initiative. And it argued that the use of ESG factors in financial analysis was indeed compatible with the investor's fiduciary responsibilities. The idea was that incorporating ESG data would help protect investments by avoiding those material financial risks from things such as climate change, worker disputes and human rights issues in supply chains, and poor corporate governance resulting in litigation. ESG refers to the environmental, social, and governance factors that can impact the long-term sustainability and societal impact of a company. Environmental issues will include things like climate change and the impacts of that, energy management, emissions, biodiversity. Social issues surround labor practices, human rights, product safety, employee health and wellness, diversity and inclusion. And governance covers areas such as board oversight, risk management, ethics, and compensation policies. It focuses the company's leadership on, how to guide the company in the right direction to have a positive impact and to be aware of where it may be having a negative impact, whether that be intentional or unintentional. The adoption of ESG did indeed start with the investment community's need to have an objective approach to use in decision-making to ensure that the risks and opportunities facing companies are fully understood and that portfolios were being priced appropriately. 2020 definitely saw an acceleration in the investment community taking action towards integrating sustainability into their decision-making. And honestly, that was a game changer. You may have heard a lot about this organization called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or GFANZ, as we were leading into COP26 last year that took place in Glasgow. And COP just standing for Confederation of the Parties, and that was their climate summit at the United Nations level in Glasgow last year. GFANZ was able to mobilize over $130 trillion in private capital that was committed to transform the economy towards net zero. That really started this conversation and really started to get sort of the money behind where the intentions have been discussed for quite some time. The ESG risks that businesses are going to face are, for the most part, unprecedented. We can no longer look to the past to predict the future any longer, and this has become a game changer. those of us who come from the finance or the accounting profession, we've always taken great comfort in the fact that we could use the past as a predictor of the future. And that's why we've always used historical information to help us trend forward. What we're seeing now in terms of environmental and social issues, they really don't have that same precedent. So we need new tools and new toolkits to start looking forward and start to create better resilience within the companies that we're working in and for. So, excuse me, ESG is becoming that lens through which all stakeholders, not just investors, but consumers and employees, regulators, and a variety of others are making decisions about the companies that they are engaging with and how they wish to engage with them. So as a result, ESG is becoming a key factor in developing a company's overall strategy. So has anyone ever thought about the difference between ESG, CSR, or corporate social responsibility, and sustainability? We often hear a little bit of confusion about what each of them are, what role they play, how they might be somewhat similar, how they might be distinct. If we were all together, I would say, who would like to, maybe challenge me on, providing a little bit of a definition. And if anybody would like to participate in this, please, again, raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you. Now, there was a time when the public stance on ESG issues was more focused around, public relations, giving information to the public outreach piece. And that's what we refer to as corporate social responsibility and the activities that fell within corporate social responsibility. However, in today's rapidly changing business climate, ESG issues is becoming critical to long-term competitive success. ESG provides measurable criteria and benchmarks and the frameworks and the standards in which to do so. When we talk about sustainability, we're talking about responsible business practices, human rights, environmental stewardship, health and safety. And there is also a framework for sustainability that can help guide the activities and help to prioritize in this regard. And that's what we refer to as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. The SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, was built on decades of work and a number of iterations in advance of it that was adopted by countries around the world who are members of the United Nations. So you've got 193 nations who are part of the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals as part of their own agendas and helping to shape their agendas at a national level. There are 17 goals, 169 targets, and 232 indicators. And where those targets and indicators really become helpful is at the company level, helping companies be able to embed sustainability in with their overall strategies. Because this was, when you look at that goal level and you look at some of the goals like, no poverty, sustainable cities and communities, all of these sorts of goals definitely are at that higher level when you think about policies. But they do indeed trickle down because it was determined and agreed to that governments can't do it alone, companies can't do it alone, citizens can't do it alone. We really need to work together. The Sustainable Development Goals really do help provide that logical framework that we also use in the ESG conversation. And last comment on the SDGs, they really do aim to address the interconnectedness between resource availability, human rights, and economic development. So while the SDGs do provide a general guide for sustainability actions, formal ESG reporting works with more specific frameworks and standards that are based on, looking at those financial implications and the impacts on stakeholders. And so the GRI, or the Global Reporting Initiative, really is a impact useful tool, and that provides standards that look at impact. The international sustainability standards that are being developed through the IFRS Foundation looks at it a little bit more from the investor lens. And then we have the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD. And as you may expect, it really does look on those climate impacts and looks at the financial impact and the financial materiality of certain issues that may face a company as it relates to climate issues. We aren't going to examine these issues in detail, although I could. I would probably really enjoy doing so, just given my background. But I just wanted you to be aware that they do exist and that they are useful tools, and you may hear about them as you start to go down this journey when you're starting to think about the process of integrating ESG and as you continue to grow as an organization. And then when you do want to start to disclose some of that information and do reporting around that for your stakeholders, these may be sort of names that you start to hear. Providing ESG information to investors, financial institutions, and informal RFP procurement processes will generally require this type of formal reporting or elements of it. So just good to be aware of them. So why has ESG evolved to this point? It's because ESG issues can cause significant financial impacts to businesses and also to the economy. And strategy and reporting can help to mitigate those risks. ESG risks are rapidly changing and are much more prevalent in today's economy. So, here we can look at some examples of risks at a global scale. The World Economic Forum issues a global risk report that identifies the top global risks by likelihood and impact. The 2022 report highlights how 8 of the top 10 global risks to businesses by impact are ESG related, with the top 3 being environmental. If we were to look at this report from about 10 to 12 years ago, the topics that dominated the global risk report were financially focused. So again, showing that change that we're starting to see. And it's not to say that these environmental and social issues do not have financial impact. We're just looking through a different lens now and seeing what will cause that financial impact in that medium to longer term. Regulators, financial institutions, employees, and customers, they're all increasingly expecting organizations to have a plan to manage these impacts. And beyond considerations related to funding and supply chains, these issues are having practical implications and impacts on running a business. Effectively, your own ESG practice is essentially investing in the social and natural inputs that your company can depend on, both today and tomorrow. So let's look at some more specific examples of these risks that I'm kind of referring to in the context of business practice. So, some of them are listed here, but, just sort of think increasing severe weather events can result in damage to assets or supply chain disruption. A lack of regulatory compliance around social and employment issues or safety issues can result in costly litigation and production or service delays. And ineffective governance can also result in costly litigation and reputational damage. And as we saw in the case of Volkswagen, that reputational damage and the litigation impacted their companies and it still does continue to impact their company, its brand. But it's important not to just look at risks without also looking at opportunities. I always sort of say it's 2 sides of one coin. So when you start to think about some opportunities, there's some listed here, but think about how improved operational efficiency, which may reduce water usage and the greenhouse gas emissions, can also result in savings on water and energy, which turns into cost savings. Addressing social and employment risks can result in growing your customer base and attracting top talent. And we continue to hear how important it is to be able to attract talent here, especially in Nova Scotia, where it seems to be, labor shortages are everywhere we turn. And effective governance can improve risk management and overall revenue and oversight of the issues that may have a financial impact. Does anyone have any questions about this? Again, I'm not hearing or seeing any hands being raised. So what we're going to do is to put you now in some breakout groups. And Sarah Lamb, I'm going to ask for your help in that. And we'd like you to think about some ESG risk examples that you might be seeing in your business or in your sector or the supply chain that you're dealing with. So we're going to place you in these breakout rooms. You can discuss together. And then what I'm going to ask you to do is when we come back together, one of the first things that you should do when you break into your breakout groups is identify someone who can be the spokesperson for your group. Then when we come back together, we'll ask most of you, depending on how many groups we have and how much time we have, to just report back what were some of the key findings that you found when you're talking about some of the environmental, social, and governance issues, again, within your company, industry, supply chain, what you're hearing about, what you're worried about, maybe what keeps you awake at night. So we're going to give about 5-7 minutes for you to discuss, and then we'll come back.
All right, so I'd love to hear from some of you as to what sort of some common themes or what some challenges or risks or opportunities that you were able to identify. So I'm going to we had 8 groups. So I'm going to ask the group number 3 if the individual that you would have named to be your spokesperson for the group, if you could give some feedback as to what you were talking about, what sort of takeaways that you got from your discussion.
Okay, I think that was me. If I'm incorrect and I'm not group number 3, somebody else jump in.
We're in room 3, Monica, you're good.
Good. I'm Monica. I'm with Invest Nova Scotia, and we had a good group. For us, we had a couple of consultants, a large corporation, a couple of small corporations, and myself, a crown corporation. So one of the comments was around for consultants being asked more about their own ESG policies. What are they taking into considerations? Do they have the frameworks and measures and that sort of thing? It's being asked a little bit more frequently, being asked to help out with some of that work for others who are doing it. So my takeaway, and please jump in, the person who was saying this, as they go out and they consult and they talk about it, it's like, okay, well, what are your practices and how are you doing in this? One of the other comments was around a really good discussion with a winery around biodiversity, of course, and their relationship with the land and how the land affects their product and climate, but also sort of very interesting around the social aspect of, communicating and being more aware of others who have ownership with the land, our First Nations communities, and how are they working with those groups. And another comment was around when talking about sort of policies and practices within their organizations to help to have their staff bring their own values to those discussions. And I thought that was really great. So that was, and some of the obvious ones around sort of net zero, being conscious of that, and greenhouse gas emissions, of course, more on the environmental side. So more on the social, environmental, with a little bit on the governance was the focus of our discussion.
Wonderful. Thanks for that, Monica. Thank you. How about group 5, if you wouldn't mind? And yes, I am putting people on the spot because I can't see you, so I have to call you out. I hope that's all right.
So I don't know our group number though, but I can definitely go ahead.
And, I think you were in group 2.
Yeah, I am okay. So maybe group 5 can go first.
It's all good.
Okay.
You volunteered yourself. You can go.
Okay,
Yeah, and then we'll do group 5 because I think I hear somebody in the background. So yes, we'll do 2 and then 5. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. So we talked about supply chain disruption, especially during the pandemic. It became a major issue, major risk for the organizations. And then importance of paying attention to tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, in some cases, tier 3 suppliers, depending on the operations, and the reliability and also the ethical sourcing topic. Then our team member Tom brought a very important topic to the discussion. It's the war between Ukraine and Russia and the impact on the energy situation, not only in those countries, but globally, and also for the future potential deficit of energy needs. Because when we are talking about net zero, we doesn't say that we won't use any fossil fuels or different fuels, but it's more about finding eco-friendly solutions and relying on newer technologies to meet the targets. And then Jeff brought another important point about the manufacturing and production and importance of creating a positive environmental impact with meaningful actions. If we don't do that, we will continue to consume energy, water, and create a negative environmental impact. So this all translates both ways. If we manage properly, it will become an opportunity. If we can't, it will become a risk from the ESG point of view. The last but not least, Troy also emphasized the importance of governance, having ethical governance, code of conduct, and elimination of any risk related to corruption, bribery, and also one important focus should be offsetting what we are using with alternative resources. This is also relating to, of course, creating constantly positive environmental impact. Yeah, these were the discussion points for our group.
Wonderful. And I'm just making notes, so we'll come back and I sent some comments to make on some of them. So thank you very much for that. And so now I guess group 5.
Okay.
Yeah.
John Cascadden for group 5. Our group really, it's as it started out, we're all sort of ESG newbies. So we were searching for someone, and I sort of got volunteered as the lead, and we spent most talking about what I'm involved with, which is researching emerging technologies for municipal solid waste processing, with a focus of turning municipal solid waste into a green hydrogen product at the end. The concept is to get value out, rather than bury waste, get value out of all of it. At the start, you want to have people create less waste totally. You want to recycle all waste that you possibly can. And when you get to the bottom end where you think you're going to throw it away and bury it in the landfill, then that waste material, which has a significant amount of hydrogen in its chemical components of the material, can be converted through various processes to produce a marketable and environmentally safe green hydrogen product. And what you achieve in that, not only by creating energy, but the process, 23% of the methane gas that is released into the atmosphere comes from landfills throughout our country. And that's a significant amount. So if we can stop putting waste into the landfill and convert it into a green hydrogen product, we increase our green energy assets, while at the same time reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. And we sort of bounce that around. One of our late joiners to our group, Peter, and I hope I don't mispronounce your name, Peter Polowansky. I might ask him to. Oh, okay, perfect. If I might ask him to just speak a bit, because he has his company has a little more ESG activity than what I have as a dedicated ESG didn't really fit in mine, although what we were doing has ESG attributes to it, but we don't identify it as. So I'll just ask Peter maybe to speak a bit to his side.
Sure, John, and it's still morning. Good morning, everyone. Peter Polonowski. So I'm a senior consultant with Upswing Solutions. We're a small but growing sustainability consulting firm based out of Halifax, Nova Scotia. But I'm coming to you guys from Cochrane, Alberta, just outside of Calgary. So we help, we deliver commercial strategies that build sustainable, resilient, inclusive businesses. What does that mean? Well, we work with all sorts of organizations, whether it's their ESG reporting, doing their value chain analysis, doing their baseline emissions. And I mean, ESG issues and opportunities, I mean, there's so many, definitely scope 3 emissions, and working with companies across their value chain to accurately, measure and report on their scope 3. there's so many different ways to measure scope 3 emissions along the value chain, and often you can't. Often there's not enough time or I guess expertise or resources to accurately report on those emissions. So you end up doing estimates. In terms of, just trying to think of, I lost my train of thought, but anyways, I'll get back to you guys. It's still early in the morning for me.
No, thank you. I can imagine if you're in Alberta area, then it's probably very early in the morning. So thanks for being here. So I'll stop putting all of you on the spot, and thanks so much for your feedback. And just to, I guess, start, Peter, with some of the comments you had made when we start talking about emissions and the various scopes. We will touch on that a little bit later on in the presentation, but again, we aren't going to get into a whole lot of detail on that, but you are encouraged to reach out, and we can have that more in-depth conversation. But we won't be getting into that level of detail in this particular workshop. We do want to just sort of start the thinking and start the ball rolling. But John, when you were speaking, something that really resonated, and I just wanted to sort of share is working with a lot of startups and sort of companies who have identified, as you have, sort of what is one of those key challenges that are that if we can solve some of these challenges, we can solve some of the world's biggest problems. And so what you're doing is you're creating a solution that addresses so many of these ESG factors, but at the same time, it's making sure that you also do it in a way that really embraces the full picture. So as you're working through your own company, your own purpose and your product and your solution is to make sure you're still keeping those other factors in mind, such as where's your workforce coming from, what are your safety, what your safety issues like, what is your supply chain like, what do all these sorts of things. So it's to keep top of mind all the various elements within the 3 pillars as you're taking a product, which again addresses some of our biggest problems. So that's fantastic. And sort of working backwards, when we heard from group 2, a lot around, supply chain, new technology, that sort of thing, and innovation is sort of the theme that started to come out. And I am going to share with you after I stop talking, one company that's doing something that's quite innovative, but using very simple approach. So that was, I'm excited to share that with you. And then finally, the first group we were talking about, or you were talking a little bit, or you touched on biodiversity. And, biodiversity is absolutely taking the center stage alongside climate, because it's really difficult to talk about climate if you're not also talking about biodiversity, because they definitely go hand in hand, and we need both if we're going to be able to get to our targets in the end. And so what's interesting, so China is hosting COP15, which is the biodiversity summit. And, just because of restrictions right now in the country, COVID, that sort of thing, they're actually holding the biodiversity summit in Montreal. So I am going to be going to that, and I'm really excited to just keep sharing whatever I learned from that in terms of what are we going to do in terms of frameworks for biodiversity in the same way that we do for climate. How will we start to put some global finance behind some of these big biodiversity issues? So definitely it's the time for biodiversity as well. Okay, so what I'm going to do, and thank you very much for that feedback. And those of you who didn't have the opportunity to participate, there'll be lots more chances. So thank you. So here's an example. So we often think about ESG issues and, what do we have to do? What innovations do we have to put in place? But here's a real life example right here in Halifax of a company that's creating an opportunity by managing their ESG risks. So this is an example that was shared with us by Wade Keller, who is the Director of Corporate Affairs with Labatt's Breweries in Atlantic, Canada. To quote Wade, "Having a safe and plentiful supply of water is integral to our business. You can't make beer without water." So what they've done is they've implemented annual targets for all their breweries in Canada and around the world to reduce the amount of water they use. In Halifax, in the 10 years from 2012 to 2021, they have reduced water usage from 4.73 down to 3.73 liters of water per liter of beer. So think about that reduction, right? They're now saving 80 million liters of water per year compared to just 10 years ago. So to put this into perspective, that's enough to fill 32 Olympic-sized swimming pools. The environmental benefits are obvious, and the improved efficiency also means substantial savings on their water bill. Some of the solutions have been fairly easy to implement as well. So one of their solutions is, so if you think about it, they rinse their tanks 3 times after a brew of beer. And the water from the third rinse is relatively clean. So what they've done is they've started using that water from the third rinse to be the water for the first rinse in their next tank. So that saves hundreds of liters of water. And that solution actually came from the workers on the production floor. So it's not always that you need this new technology or equipment to be able to put some measures into place. It's sometimes focusing on the efficiency as your first step. And so these improvements, something like this didn't cost a lot, but even when you do need to bring in new technology or equipment, quite often they pay for themselves within a couple of years. And that's actually what Labatt is finding. And so if you also, given that this solution did come from the employees themselves, it has been a point of pride within their staff. And, all of these water saving initiatives is coming a point of pride with the workers all across the country. And so now they actually have a bit of a competition on water savings within their network. So it's just a really neat story that we want to share with you. So their number one goal is to protect a valuable natural resource, which is water. But it also had the added benefit of saving money and building employee engagement. So, as we go into our first formal break, just to think about, what other opportunities can you think of within your own sector, within your own companies, and just to see, if you can start thinking about how to apply some of these strategies as we go forward. So with that, we are going to take a networking break. And so again, Sarah's going to open up a breakout room for anybody who wants to network a little bit. It's a good chance for you to get to know your peers in the room, share some ESG knowledge and experience, and help prepare us to work together for a little later on. And here's also some questions that you can think about to get the conversation started within your groups. So Sarah, I'm going to ask you to work your magic again.
Yep, just a quick note to everybody, the groups are going to be a little bit larger this time, and you'll be with new people, hopefully. So I'll open those up. If you have any trouble, pop back out into the main lobby and we can help you out.
All right, so we'll get started. So hopefully you all had a chance to get to know each other a little bit and talk about all things ESG. Great. So now that we've learned a little more about what ESG is and talked, briefly about some of the risks and opportunities, we're going to examine the business case. And when we say business case, it's, why are we having this conversation and why does it matter? So far we've looked at the individual components of ESG, and now we're going to pull together some of those pieces to look at that sort of overall picture. As I mentioned before, an ESG practice is essentially your own investment in the natural and social capitals that your business relies on. We heard in some of the feedback that biodiversity is a key element of, business from, production for getting your product to market. We already know that we're having issues around, human capital, being able to get people to come work, all those sorts of things. And this is what ESG aims to look at in terms of finding those opportunities to create the robust strategy. When we do talk about natural capital, something to keep in mind is half of the world's GDP is moderately or highly dependent on nature. So just think about that. That represents over $44 trillion in economic generation. Also daily, we are provided with reminders of the risks associated with climate change, civil unrest, societal inequalities, the COVID-19 pandemic, and the ongoing uncertainties resulting from the geopolitical instability, which we'd heard, one example of that referenced earlier today, and the businesses need to adapt. Recent years have highlighted the importance of sustainability and environmental, social, and governance, or ESG considerations, in unprecedented ways. And again, to quote the World Economic Forum again, one of the recent reports found that many industries have significant hidden dependencies on nature within their supply chain. And they actually may be at more risk of disruption than what they had originally expected. So the need to adapt has never been greater. So when we talk about the benefits of integration and the business case for ESG, here's some of the key points to keep in mind. So we talk about how it improves financial performance. And as some of the examples that we talked about earlier, you can lower your cost of operations by focusing on increased efficiencies and reducing waste. Also, on the other extreme, avoiding catastrophic losses by being able to look through a different lens and get ahead of some of these issues and think about that financial impact that can result from environmental and social factors. Also, driving competitive advantage. By embracing environmental, social, and good governance issues and factors, it leads to improved stakeholder engagement and all stakeholders, again, not just investors. It helps to foster innovation and it builds customer loyalty. And there's a lot of research right now that has been done by a variety of organizations that demonstrate how consumers increasingly will look for companies for products and services that align with their values, and most often are willing to pay more for those that do. So really, again, creating that relationship with your consumers, with your customers. Also improve risk management by proactively identifying and mitigating operational risks. It's looking at enterprise risk management, including those other elements around climate and social issues that may not have necessarily been integrated before. Increase access to capital. This is increasingly becoming top of mind for a lot of companies as they're looking for financing. One area that ESG definitely does do, even though I keep saying it's not just about the investors, it really does enhance investor relationships. Investors want to know that the companies they're working with do pay attention to environmental, social, and good governance issues. They are seen, companies who do embrace ESG are seen to be less risk and therefore more worthy of financing and investment. And also we're seeing lower costs associated with capital. So, and it can go either way. In some jurisdictions, we do see that financial institutions are actually offering incentives in the form of discounted lending rates for companies that do embrace certain environmental and social factors. We're also starting to hear from some of our clients that banks are even looking at perhaps charging a little bit more. So sort of the flip side of it, the carrot or the stick, I guess, but it's charging a little bit more for access to financing if companies don't embrace these sorts of issues. We're seeing also a lot of just, this morning it was announced, significant investment going into companies who are starting to look a little bit more towards those social and human elements around ESG. So just a lot of focus on this from, again, that financial sector. And, the financial sector has definitely been driving a lot of this, and regulation, of course, soon to follow, which we'll get into. And then finally, actually, I guess a couple things, strengthening brand and image. So when you do embrace an ESG strategy, your company is known to be a company that cares about these issues. And as we're starting to see the public perception change towards environmental and social factors, companies, again, that are embracing it, their brand gets stronger and they have a stronger image to put forward. And of course, that can open up new markets, strengthen sales, all those sorts of things. And then finally, attracting and engaging employees. Employees, when they know that they are part of their overall strategy, because employees are part of that social pillar, among other things, there is a distinct correlation between employee loyalty, engagement, and productivity. Again, we won't go into that a lot today, but there's increasing evidence going around that. So definitely, again, a great way to attract and retain those key employees that help your business, thrive and grow into the future. So when we look specifically to small, medium-sized enterprises, and I would put micro-sized enterprises in here, of course, as well, they are indeed the backbone of our economies and society, provincially, regionally, nationally, and globally. And while the challenges SMEs may face are often unprecedented, so too are the opportunities. And John, your company has embraced one of these opportunities, just in terms of looking at what some of these issues are. But there's also opportunities within an existing company that can be enhanced as well, which we also just recently looked at in this presentation. Another benefit that SMEs have is they're able to move quickly. They can make decisions around their strategy, and they're relatively close with their staff, their customers, and their other stakeholders, which allows for a deeper understanding of the needs of their stakeholders. And then the companies and the SMEs can then adjust accordingly in a very, be very responsive. And that's definitely a benefit to SMEs. And by focusing on this broader range of issues, SMEs can ensure succession by reinforcing the business's long-term viability, making it fit for the next generation, and increase the business's ultimate sale value should it want to go that route. Exporting, supply chains, and investment and funding are key ESG considerations for SMEs. So we're going to take a look at those a little bit further now. SMEs are present in the value chain of large corporations. So you think about a large value chain and all the elements and all the companies that go in it, right up to these, large corporations. So this can impact the ESG metrics so if you're a small company who perhaps isn't paying attention to your ESG within your strategy, and then it trickles up to these large corporations that are funded through pension funds, let's say, or other forms of investment where ESG considerations are paramount, they will likely be asking for ESG status from those companies along their supply chain, because any element of a chain affects the whole. And then we get into those risks that we talked about earlier, whether they be reputational, financing, all of those sorts of things. So increasingly, investment or financing decisions are likely to depend on ESG information. So are your supply chain decisions. And we're also starting to see some impacts around regulation in international markets. While the financial sector has indeed been driving a lot of this, regulation is now stepping up, because we've always knew we needed both. And regulation is now stepping up to say, okay, so we have to put some structure in place to enable this shift. So regulation has always been that sort of enabler of businesses to be able to know what sort of framework to work within. So the one thing that I just want to reinforce as we start to wrap this up is that value chain. Just keep in mind, as a company within an overall supply chain or value chain, you never want to be that weakest link, because the weakest link will be replaced. And that's part of the conversation that's starting to happen now. Now, since the pandemic, we continue to experience an ongoing supply chain disruptions. And this continues to be exacerbated by extreme weather events, social unrest, and geopolitical instability. It's disrupting the flow of goods, extending delivery times, forcing increased costs, and impacting customer satisfaction. So think about even in your own supply chain, and think about what issues that you're facing. One element that you may not have necessarily thought about that we're starting to hear a little bit more going on about in terms of even where federal regulation might hit in Canada is around the use of forced labor. And I think one of the standards and one of the frameworks we refer to as modern day slave labor, but it's that forced labor, child labor, whatever you want to call it, that is becoming so important within our supply chains. And I'll give an example. One client I was working with, they had a very large multinational customer and that they produced into. And this customer had very stringent ESG policies, and it was truly embedded into the core of their business. And they wanted to make sure that throughout their supply chain that there was no forced labor. So they actually sent a team, or planning to send a team, to rural Nova Scotia for 3 days to ensure that there was no forced labor throughout the supply chain. This was a small company needing to demonstrate that, throughout its value chain. So it really is hitting home. And it is interesting because they reached out and they said, is this what I think it is? And I said, yeah, you've got a customer who really has an embedded ESG policy. And it was lucky that they had already started down that journey. So they're already one step ahead. But, companies are definitely taking this stuff seriously. So we're going to actually pop you into another breakout room. And when you're in there, I'd like you to consider the supply chains that you're engaged in. What are the potential risks to your business? Based on everything we've learned so far, talk about the potential supply chain risks, within your groups for a few minutes, and then we'll come back and hear about a few of them. And, I think the groups are all going to change. So we're going to ask maybe some of you to volunteer who haven't already had the chance to share. And so, think about, your access to a reliable workforce and your ability to meet their obligations. Think about climate and transportation and how the pandemic and weather events may have affected your ability to get your goods and your products and services to market. Who you partner with, what labor practices are they using? Think about emissions, think about Indigenous relations and changing regulations at the, municipal, federal, provincial level, internationally. And also diversity and equity and inclusion within your supply chain and, reputational risk, all those sorts of things. Because then the reason why it's great to have this conversation is investors and supply chains, as I mentioned, will start asking you those questions. So with that, if there's no questions before we pop you in, Sarah is going to again put you into another breakout group and probably for about 10 minutes or so, just to talk about some of these issues that you might be having, and then we'll come back and have a bigger conversation. So thanks everyone and welcome back. So it would be great to hear some of your feedback. We didn't pop into the rooms, giving you lots of time to be able to talk amongst yourself, but would anybody like to offer some of their thoughts or what they heard in their breakout rooms in terms of, what they're seeing in their supply chains? Maybe somebody from group number 1.
I think Dave Strong had his hand up there.
Oh, perfect. Great. Hi, Dave.
Hi. So in our group, we heard a couple of examples. One was around the realities of working in climate where we're in the north, where we're getting thawing. That's causing a lot of difficulty in terms of timing to be able to get in and do some work, even though the type of work is very much in support of ESG goals and move towards net zero, et cetera. It's causing a lot of difficulty that they really need to give thought to as you're moving, how to actually put that on the ground in these communities, because it has, increased costs, the timeline, and shorter construction times because it may impact on the environment, et cetera. So there's a lot of thinking has to go into this. There's a lot of impact. We also switched on being the supplier side for like professional services, seem to be the dominant part of the topic, and what that would look like for very small SMEs, say people less than 5. And the question is, what's a reasonable expectation for that small company to be able to put in to demonstrate its participation in ESG? Because it's okay to hold the values of ESG, but then the documentation that would go with that is another thing. And how much is it? What's the expectation today and where it might be going in the future? We'd like some feedback from you folks on that around people who are bidding on these small jobs. Is there a chance that they would be frozen out because they can't do that? And then especially from public procurement perspective, like public bodies that are asking for, that is part of their scoring criteria for participation in ESG. So it's like, what does this actually look like for a small business anywhere in Atlantic Canada, less than 5 employees? How do they authentically participate in this ESG conversation so they don't get frozen out? And where is it all headed anyways? So that they need to be mindful of that. I think to the group that I was in, did that sort of capture the spirit of the 2 conversations we had, or did I miss something?
I think it does, Dave. The only thing I might add is the responsibilities and I guess accountabilities. Is there any kind of again, if you're less than 5 people versus a consulting firm like Deloitte, right? Is the expectation the same no matter the size and the scale and the scope of work? Is that burden fair? I guess maybe, I don't know if fair is the right word, but again, if you hold the values of ESG, but you might not just have the ability to document, demonstrate in the same way that a very, very large firm could.
Right. Okay. Before we go on to another group, I would excellent feedback. I would love to address a couple of those things so we don't lose the thoughts. But we have Lindy Greening here from the province, and he has his hand up. So I'd love to be able to call on Lindy to offer some thoughts before I kind of give you some feedback.
Oh, thanks, Nancy. No, I was actually just going to comment on both what Dave and Monica had stated with some of the conversation in their groups, because it really is important, I think, as government, but generally as everyone follows down this pathway of ESG, that we don't lose sight that we can't use it as a stick. And I hope it doesn't become that. I have seen other certifications, good, well-intentioned, be kind of switched over to be used as a stick versus a carrot. And what I'm concerned about, and I raised it in our open discussion in-person session, and that's rural communities. A lot of the Atlantic provinces, or most of the Atlantic provinces, have great SMEs based in small rural communities that don't have a lot of diversity. They don't have a lot of eligible or educated or skilled trades that they can draw from for those special or highly technical skills jobs that they need. So they have to rely on what they have, and if that means that your workforce isn't very diverse and your board of directors isn't very diverse, or does it appear inclusive, I hope that people, globally, when we're looking at this and trying to make it, I think Monica used the term fair, and maybe that is the right word. I hope it's looked at in a fair and equitable way, that these SMEs may not have those options, and that they are doing the best they can. So that's one comment that I'd make. But
okay, thank you, Lindy. Yeah, and again, not wanting to let too much time go by between these comments or whatever, I will just sort of offer some perspective, because it seems like you were asking some direct questions. Building on what Lindy had just said, and Dave, what you had raised, when we talk about how this will be, implemented, and Lindy sort of touched on it, when we start to look at the communities that you're working in, it's true. We see it in certain industries that have been predominantly focused on one gender, maybe aging population, all these sorts of issues that sort of go far, like maybe become a little bit more systemic in terms of how do we get to the point where we can embrace more diversity, more equity, more inclusion, those sorts of things. So what I always suggest as an approach is you want to make sure that you are representative of the communities that you're working in. So right now, if your labor force is, you can only access talent that may be, predominantly one gender, for example, or identifying as one gender, then, you can't, there's only so much you can do. But to be able to make sure that your practices are becoming more all-encompassing, and that you are making sure that you are doing what you can to make it a more inclusive work environment, so that your policies, your operations, what you do, sort of like when the rubber hits the road, if you will, that you are embracing a much more diverse way of thinking. Because at the board level, it's not so much you just want to look at, okay, so how many individuals do I have on the board that represent, traditionally unrepresented groups, or who identify as women, men, what have you. It's not so much that you can say, oh, I have 50% split or meeting some sort of a quota. But what you're trying to do is to make sure that you have the most diversity of thought that you can get on that board, to make sure that you can see anything that might be coming at you, that you do create that awareness, that perspective, and that broader oversight. So that's where the value is, the opportunity, if you will, in it. So it's really see the benefits of getting that. So, and just as a bit of a tangent, just in Europe last week, they did pass sort of a quota system, if you will. It's getting a lot of feedback of saying that traditionally unrepresented perspectives need to now be on the board at least 30%. So 30% of your board has to come from those who are traditionally unrepresented on these corporate boards. Some are saying, well, it just becomes a quota. You're ticking a box. Are you going to get the best people? Are you going to get the right skills? But what you're doing is you're showing the amount of work you're going to put in to making sure you've got all the competencies you need on the board, and you're making it a very purposeful, thoughtful process, and really going through the competencies, as opposed to saying, hey, I know so-and-so who'd be great on the board, and bring them along, and you might start to get that group think. So I just sort of put that out there. When you talk about the size of organizations, and when we talk about, like, less than 5, I put those sort of in that micro kind of piece of the micro, small, medium enterprises. There is even already an understanding and an appreciation of the challenges that these smaller companies will face in embedding some of this stuff. So even with what we're seeing being rolled out, which we'll get into in a couple of minutes and a couple of slides from a regulatory perspective, when we start to see how these things are being rolled out from a regulation perspective, they are starting with the most established companies, the larger companies who can bring this stuff in. So it is starting at that level, and it will trickle down. So there's already an awareness and an acceptance of it. And, you were talking about, small professional services firms versus a Deloitte, I think is what the example was. It all comes back again to what stakeholders expect. Stakeholders will expect something different from a, tens of thousands of person-sized organization with a different level of resources than they will from a company that's less than 5 people. So it's all about, expectations, stakeholder engagement. You want to make sure that you know what matters to those who matter most to you. So that's why that stakeholder outreach is so important, to find out what are the key issues. But going back to how a small company can get started is look at what you can do. So you can start to have policies and procedures and all those sorts of things that do embrace some of these issues and pay it. Something as simple as encouraging employees to come to the office with a reusable water bottle rather than having a bunch of plastic bottles in a fridge, just things like that. So it could be a whole other session, but I just wanted to give you comfort to say that it's not going to be, you need to start complying to this as of January 1st, 2023. It's what you want to do is you want to demonstrate that you're aware of the biggest risks that might be facing your organization, no matter what size, and that within those risks, you also know what's driving them. Like, where are you having an impact, and what issues are going to have an impact on your ability to meet your strategic priorities, and start to manage those. So hopefully, and Dave, if that doesn't quite answer the question, please feel free to, put your hand up, let me know. But just to give you some comfort that indeed, it's not going to be a one size fits all approach. None of this is. And regulation is taking a while to come into effect. And this is exactly the reason why. Dave, I see you're off. So yeah, okay, please.
No, I was just going to say thank you for that. And I don't know if any of the other participants in our group had any follow-up questions for Nancy on that.
Okay. So hearing none, thank you. Now, does anyone else want to share from their group? Would you like to raise their hand? Anything else we have? Okay, great, Mark.
Yeah, I don't want to, hopefully Anna will join in. I didn't necessarily fully agree with everything you just said, Nancy.
Okay.
We're a big company and we look for sub-suppliers around the world. And we have investors and we have shareholders and we have customers like cruise ship owners and power plant utilities. And they all expect us to follow these ESG principles in our own work and in selection of sub-suppliers. And we cannot make allowances for sub-suppliers because they're a small company or because locally they don't require to follow regulations or whatever. I mean, we have to go out there with a very rigorous assessment program, right? To make sure that every sub-supplier we use represents our own business, our codes of conduct and ethical business and ESG principles and everything else. And so whether it's a sub-supplier who wants to support us from Nova Scotia or a sub-supplier from a country around the world where maybe you might think that we should be more concerned with their ethical business practices, we can't make allowances because they're in Nova Scotia compared to some non-developed or underdeveloped country, right? We have to put the same level of rigor, and that's what I had.
Yeah, and if I misspoke, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to clarify. I guess I wasn't suggesting that there would be a different expectation, but the ability for a company. So in terms of, gosh, does a company have a robust strategy around greenhouse gas emissions? Are they, can a small company, look to renewable forms of energy? And what would be their impact, if you will, in terms of a large company like yourself? It wouldn't be that, a company that ignores diversity within their workforce would be acceptable. But if you had a company that was based in a rural community in Nova Scotia, and it was in a more manufacturing environment, and there just weren't enough potential employees within that community to be able to give you the resources that you need, sometimes you do have to work with what you have. But knowing that your policies around hiring and recruitment and treating of everybody within the workforce would be of a nature that would make sure that everybody felt that they were included and they were treated fairly and equitably. It would be that sort of piece, because not everybody would have access to, being able to have true, diverse representation within the workforce. So it's not that you would be looking to alter your principles or what you value, or that it's okay for someone to use forced labor within their supply chain because you need this product to come from a different country. It's not that. It's being able to make sure that you don't put the same expectation on a company that may just be starting, that doesn't have the ability to track some of these issues or have all the data that they need to be able to report on it, but they are definitely committed to those same core values that you expect. Again, it comes back to, what do stakeholders expect? What do you expect of the companies within your supply chain who are supplying to you? And they need to meet that because you're one of their most important stakeholders. It's knowing what's important. You can't do everything all at once, I guess is what I was getting to. And so you need to focus on what are the key issues that matter to those in your ecosystem who are most important to you. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm just worried about explaining it.
So Nancy, it's Lindy again, because I really would like to respond to what Mark just said. It does seem that this is being used in some situations or regards as a stick. If he is, as he states, being forced to use matrix or criteria to select who his suppliers are. And this has me personally, it has me a little bit nervous about how then we go out to talk to our supply chain, because now it's like either you do this or you're going to be whacked with a big heavy stick, and your score is going to be reflective of whatever it is, and you may lose business. So it's getting going down that rabbit hole. I hoped it wouldn't, kind of.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would almost wonder, and Mark, I'd like to have your comments on this, but we're seeing this even within the investment community. So the investment community is very clear in what they expect of the companies that they support financially. And if they aren't meeting certain targets or aren't embracing certain factors, they will engage with them to help bring them along. And eventually you get to the point where you may have to divest of that. So I would ask Mark, are you working with those companies within your supply chain to help them meet what you require in order to meet the expectations put on you? Or would you just be looking to replace them right away? Like, are you providing that sort of that space to help them get to where they need to and help to identify some of these issues that maybe they wouldn't have even seen or thought about before?
Strategic sub-supplier agreements take years to develop, and you want them to succeed, right? I mean, we build up these strategic agreements with mutually agreeable, terms and conditions and business that benefits us both, and we get the best. Our competitive pricing becomes best because we work with these companies, and but at the same time, we have to prove to our investors and shareholders in our investor relations reports and our shareholder reports and quarterly reports and annual reports that we do require these things from our sub-suppliers. So yes, we help them. We don't want to lose a relationship with a sub-supplier. In fact, if anything, you want to build that relationship, and it wants to be a long-term relationship, and because we both benefit if we do that. So no, I don't think you're going to see that you go around canceling and reestablish, you know, and making new contracts just quickly because, you know, you just find somebody better all of a sudden and you just drop somebody off. And, you know, I would say that the goal is to help them meet our goals, you know, and at the same time, they do business with us and that helps them. So I hope it's a mutual relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's, you know, and not to defer back to one of the earlier slides, but that's that whole stakeholder relationship and that building those strong relationships that is the opportunity in this. I know, Mike, you've raised some of those challenges, but there's also great opportunities that if you are that supplier to your business, for example, Mark, and you do know that you've got a company that wants to get there and is committed to getting there, just think about that relationship that you'll have in years to come. So.
And we do have strategic purchasers and you know, who are responsible for the contracts and responsible for making sure that our sub-suppliers know the expectations and, you know, how they change. But look, we I would say essentially we flow with the business, right? We flow with ESG principles as they're adopted. We flow with that. We flow with international rules for codes of conduct and ethical business. It shouldn't be a surprise to anybody. And we make sure our sub-suppliers know, you know, if things are changing that we need to ask them to change with us, right? But it's not a carrot and stick. It's not like that. It's a partnership.
Right. So Lindy, hopefully that brings some comfort in where I think your concerns were starting to come to it in terms of supporting the businesses here in the province. Okay, so we're still muted, so I guess. Oh, okay, great. So thank you very much. Would another group like to bring something forward as well? This is a great conversation. I appreciate it.
I do have a point. So by the way, Mark and I are working for the same organization. Yes, we do have the supply chain processes in place, vendor management system, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, we have a minimum criteria to meet. We expect our suppliers to meet that minimum criteria, and then we do an internal assessment to see if there's any gaps, can they be established with certain programs or actions, and how critical that supplier is or the product service they are providing. We never gave up if we believe that a supplier is critical, essential for us, for our continual improvement as well as theirs, and especially for our core products. But at the same time, we need to be very careful as all the organizations. Doing these things requires substantial time and cost, and we have to really understand and establish a timeline, because you cannot keep doing these things. If there is a supplier, let's say, and it will take years to bring them to the desired level, is it really worth? It's important to really look into that equation and take a decision accordingly. But at the same time, we have been seeing lots of companies with very similar mindset with us. They have dedicated teams constantly looking at the ways to improve their ESG footprint, their sustainability initiatives, and occupational health and safety, whatever goes with this equation. And yeah, so it's not a very, very easy thing to resolve.
No, thank you for that. And I think you just hit it right on, bang on. It's not easy. It's starting, and what you're doing is working with your suppliers to make sure that they support you in your ESG strategy, and meet those expectations that are coming of you. So to Lindy's point, this is what our businesses need to be aware of. This is the conversation we're having today, but it's to make sure that so it's almost like what you're doing is putting in place something that would mirror what regulation will eventually do, which is making sure that companies understand what's coming, what's going to be expected of them, and what they need to put in place to be able to make sure that it's in there. But all that to say that it's not a one size fits all approach, and companies do need to be adopting this. They just have to get there. Regulation would make it so that they know exactly when they need to get there. Otherwise, it's going to be up to that supply chain to help shape and influence that, and to be able to engage, like it sounds like you are, with your suppliers. So is there anyone else who wants to meet to bring anything forward, or should we move on? No one raises their hand. We'll just continue on. Great. And I do thank you for all of that. That was fantastic. So now let's turn to regulation. Perfect segue. When we talk about, when we think about ESG and exporting and regulation and how it may impact US companies, the EU does lead the way globally in implementing ESG related disclosures and reporting and expectations. In general terms, they've been at this for 2 decades, so they definitely do have some pretty strong structures in place, and very clear expectations on companies and what they expect of them. And the regulations continue to change and modify to keep up. In the coming years, new and updated reporting will be enacted, where investors and issuers, companies themselves, will need to start reporting on business impacts, including within the supply chain. So going back to the exact conversation we just had, this is, they're all being rolled out now. And what's happening a lot in Europe, some new rules were just passed in the last couple of weeks, which I won't go into detail now, but it will impact the largest companies, that they will have to start disclosing their environmental and social impacts and start tracking that in 2024 for disclosures to happen in 2025, but for that prior year. And it's going to be phased in over a number of years to capture most organizations. So for Nova Scotia businesses that are exporting to or are part of a supply chain with operations in the EU, ESG considerations are indeed going to increase over the next 3 years, to a point that by 2025, companies that aren't ESG aligned will see barriers to entry. And the conversation we just had definitely reinforces that. The current and upcoming ESG regulation in the EU includes Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the European Green Bonds Regulation, and the European Commission's Directive on Corporate Social Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence. So lots of words there, but just in case you hear those terms coming around, and all of which are expected to affect the supply chain as early as 2025. So the clock is ticking, and it's important to start thinking about these things now, so that you aren't caught off guard and potentially risk opportunities as part of a larger supply chain. In Asia, there has been a 2-fold increase in ESG policies across Asia in the last 5 years. So from 2017 to 2022, corporate ESG disclosures exist amongst or across most Asia Pacific markets. And climate reporting is definitely leading the way, with the framework that I referred to earlier, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or the TCFD framework. And then also some more investor-focused, like the SASB standards. And they're sort of coming into that international conversation around sustainability standards. And it is requiring and leading to government and, really embedding these things, and also having it embedded at the highest level, so at that governance level of an organization, and trickle down into business strategy and operationalizing, embracing in the metrics and targets that are reported. So, so definitely change is happening. And then looking at investors and ESG. And as a company who is if you are looking to grow and looking to attract investment, this one's probably pretty important. Access to capital, of course, being one of the key issues here. And the more risks that are identified through ESG metrics, the harder it will be to secure financing and investment. And we're starting to see a lot of changes happening. Like it used to be, years ago, and not that many years ago, that it was sort of the larger publicly traded companies that were being sort of pushed by their investors to start to embed these issues. we are increasingly seeing a real surgence in embracing certain environmental, social, and good governance principles at the startup and at the venture fund level. Actually, one of the organizations that are doing a lot of work with the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment. This organization is called Venture ESG, and they are really trying to bring the conversation to light around why embedding ESG at the earliest stage of a company is so important. Even if you can't, report on everything and embrace everything tomorrow, you can start to change the culture at the earliest possible stage in a company, and that's so important. So about 75% of private equity firms have walked away from investments that raise ESG flags. And if it hasn't come through loud and clear already, ESG risks are financial risks and true business risks. And venture capital and private equity, they want to make sure that whatever's being invested in, that it will lead to viable businesses that are embracing a broader perspective other than just what will our next quarterly results look like from a financial perspective. Over 50% of private equity firms use ESG criteria in their search for investment opportunities. And private equity and venture capital are increasingly seeking relationships that do achieve long-term multi-stakeholder value. So not just from that financial input, looking at the impact across all stakeholders. And there's a growing community of private equity and venture capital firms working to share that understanding and trying to develop frameworks and metrics that can start to measure ESG performance at this earliest stages of companies. And venture ESG would be one of them. And staying ahead of the regulations for commercial advantage is so important. So European private equity firms are leading the way in adoption, and they're at about 66%, with other jurisdictions now playing catch up. So, it's definitely making this conversation very important, very timely. And I'm not sure if anybody on the call, and not to put Lindy on the spot, but with RFP processes within government RFP, starting to ask for more ESG considerations to be put into the RFP process. Also, we have BDC. They've issued detailed guidance related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they're also increasingly expecting companies that they deal with to integrate ESG into their strategies and business decision-making in order to be considered by BDC. And all of this logic extends to lending institutions as well. And I touched on this earlier, but we're not seeing a lot of it here yet. There is a growing trend toward offering lower interest rates and preferred lending terms for companies who do adopt ESG within their strategy and ESG practices. And, because they are seen as lower overall risk, because they are focused on creating resilience within the organization to adapt to social and environmental issues that may come to fruition, and also seen as making sure that they are meeting their own regulatory requirements and staying ahead of any regulatory requirements that may come down the pipe. So legislation is expected to be passed in the next year here in Canada that will require banks and insurance providers to disclose their financed activities that are related to climate. So in other words, bank and insurance companies not only will need to address their own internal risks linked to climate risks, but also with the companies that they lend to. So that really starts to make it so companies need to start really wrapping their heads around this. And social metrics will soon be to follow, I expect. Okay, so we have a break here, but I don't know necessarily that we need a break. But what I'm going to do is just before we get into our last activity, like we will take about maybe a 5-minute break, but I just want to make sure that there's no other questions at this point or anything that anybody would like to raise, because we're going to start to get into now an activity to help get you starting to think as a small, medium-sized company, how you can start to think about these issues. Going back to Mark's comment, about how their company is expecting certain things from their supply chain, how can you sort of start to think about getting started? But before we go into that activity, before we break for 5 minutes to give you a chance just to maybe go grab a glass of water or coffee, does anybody have anything else that they'd like to bring forward or to ask or just to raise? As I sit here and stare at the screen waiting for a hand to go up. Okay. Okay, so Sarah, maybe what we'll do is we'll take just a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll look at an activity, which will be our final activity of the day, and then we'll wrap up. But to look at those sort of practical applications and how you can go about being able to get started within your organization.